Mr. Miracle 3 uses the 9-panel grid to create a wonderful effect during a sequence where Scott Free, drinking milk in his living room, talks to Forager. It highlights a few interesting elements about the grid that's worth exploring, but also some interesting points about colour and texture in Gerads' work. Before diving in, if you've been enjoying Mr. Miracle, the latest issue of Panel by Panel, my new digital magazine on comics, craft and criticism, has Mr. Miracle as its feature book this month. It's got an extensive interview with King and Gerads on their storytelling, and we talk about 9-panel grids, grid structures generally, themes, subtext, art styles, history, loads and loads and loads of stuff, as well as a ton more craft and creative pieces from people like Kelly Thompson, Alison Sampson, Chris Brunner, and way more. It's available now for $2.50 for over 100 pages of content at panelxpanel.com. Anyway, the grid structure can be playful, in that it doesn't need to be an actual amount of panels the grid is based around to still be in that structure. So we can think of something like Watchmen, which often has pages that might only be 6 or 7 panels, but still using the 9-panel grid, so they'll just let some of the gutters disappear and extend some of the panels into the space. Mr. Miracle doesn't do that. It's almost uniformly 9 panels. Even when it contains a polyptych, a visual that sits across more than one panel, it happens twice in conversations with Forager back to back here in this scene. And by not allowing these images to break the gutters, it does two things. First, it treats each image as a separate moment, right? It means that each beat is more specifically its own beat, as opposed to one larger unit of storytelling, which is how I always like to see these things. Each panel is one beat, though each panel can also contain multiple beats. As a unit in the page, it equals 1, especially in the way Tom King writes. So here we're being asked to focus on the individual moment, just Scott Free, then move to just Forager. Which does bring up the second point and, well, the question of why. Well, the gutter appears to block them from each other. King and Gerads are actually using the structure of the page as a way to cut off Scott Free from the other characters around him. If you look at the other pages in the scene, Scott and Forager only share a panel once out of about 40 times, and that feels quite purposeful. Because by not allowing Scott and Forager to come together except for that one individual moment, and we will get to that one in a second, it means they feel distant from each other. Even when they're sat across from each other on the same sofa, Scott is still removed from the world of Forager. And that gutter is really noticeable for a few reasons, which gets into Gerads' art. The page contains very few instances of white. It's mostly sort of dark, dank colours with an overall desaturated palette that relies quite heavily on greys and green tones. It means that when you splash white on the images, such as with Scott's bandages, they're really noticeable. And the white in these gutters do the exact same thing, standing out and drawing the eye by their sheer brightness in contrast to everything else. They also eradicate anything that might cross over with them, such as the linking tail on the speech balloon in the moment. They are voids, they're knocking everything out of place and making you feel aware of their existence. So King and Gerads are asking us to notice the distinct line between them. It's exactly the same with the second example of it happening as well, with Scott looking to the right at Forager and that white line being sat right in the middle of the path of their vision. And tracking their conversation, you see how Gerads and King keep them separate for all these other moments. They never invade each other's space, never enter each other's moments, and there's a distance between them. It works as a visual reinforcement for the idea that Scott feels alone. Even when someone comes to visit him, it's hard for him to break his outer shell, that prison he's kind of trapped himself in, or the barrier that's been put up to be protected. In that way, the visuals of the 9-panel grid emulate the look of prison bars on a cell, like every page is being trapped by its own structure. Gerads increases this effect by his colour palettes too. The reality of Scott's world is bleak. It's a very limited palette, and not all that saturated. Just those greens and blues, the colours of sick, of poison, and isolation. It's very fitting for Scott's current mind frame. Forager looks different, in a saturated red and blue costume. He looks out of that world, right? He's far too removed from anything else that we've come to understand to be reality. The only other thing being that Mr. Miracle throwback cover Easter egg poster in the background. So there's a visual signifier here that superheroes are elevated beyond normality. They often have saturated colours to distinguish them. Within the greater context of the story though, it helps to imply something else. Because we've seen moments in previous issues before where Scott has interacted with characters who have died, or heavily implied that they don't exist at least. His entire reality is distorted, and so we find it hard to fully believe anything that only Scott sees by himself. Gerads' use of the dramatically different colour palettes and placing this character into the world where he looks entirely out of place helps really strongly imply that there's something here that isn't right. Similar to the Paper Girls episode previously with Matt Wilson's colouring, it's like the work is calling attention to itself. And that's done almost primarily just through colours. There's obviously the narrative link for the moments that have happened previous, but so much of this is being told just through the colours that Mitch Gerads chooses to use on the page and in the scene for these characters. And that's really special. And when you combine that with the fact that Scott and Forager never actually sit in the same panel, it's easy enough to see this whole thing as a figment of his imagination. The panels that show, reality never mix with the panels that show fiction, until that single panel I mentioned. Here we understand something, that the reality seemed to be there in all the panels, or at least that's what the previous language would say to us. When Light Ray turns up and kills Forager, that opening of that sequence shows Forager and Scott together. All of a sudden, the understanding of the previous pages has changed a little bit. Is Scott as unstable as he's being told? And it's also interesting that the only time we see him are in those fearful moments with Forager. That's the only time they cross over, with Forager's scared face as he realizes he's about to die, and Scott Free in the background. He's helpless, powerless, tiny as well in the frame. So you can see how interesting the grid is just across this single sequence, used as more than a way to just lay out the information, but actually the grid itself taking on some of the storytelling duties. The restricted, limited nature of the grid links to the way Scott Free is feeling in the story, and the gutters work as storytelling units themselves to bring up visual barriers between characters. So it's another angle to look at and understand grids in comics. They aren't just there as a way to arbitrarily lay out information, but they themselves can have a profound impact on the narrative playing across the page. In the hands of Tom King and Mitch Gerads, they're used impeccably. Thanks for watching. Strip Panel Naked continues to exist as a weekly show thanks to the supporters on Patreon, where for their pledge they get access to exclusive new content every single week. Check it out and consider pledging. For more comics talk and analysis, you can find me on Twitter at HassanOE, and finally hit subscribe and that little notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and we'll see you next time.